Welcome to this special presentation on the history and legacy of industry in Newark, sponsored by the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, a state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has provided funding for this program. In the fall of 2011, the Council sponsored a series of community forums, inviting panels of university and community scholars to consider the historic relationships that have existed between New Jersey's environments and local views on justice. Highlights of the second forum, Newark's Industrial Legacy, will be featured in this 30-minute program. Economic activity lifted Newark to prominence. How has the shifting nature of industry in New Jersey's largest city impacted the urban environment? Why does it matter?
When I say the word nature, I'm sure most people in this room and most people in the world would not think of Newark, New Jersey, right? We would think of a place like maybe Yellowstone National Park out in Wyoming, wild Wyoming, right? Well, I would like to talk about how in Yellowstone we have very, very monumental nature. It's very, very obvious nature. We have tall mountains, we have large green trees and crystal blue lakes. But Newark, if you think about it, has just as much nature. There's just as much nature in Newark as there is in Yellowstone, but it looks a lot different. Newark's nature is more subtle. The water pouring from our faucets as we brush our teeth in the morning, the air we breathe as we're commuting to work every day, and maybe the small backyard garden or the local park that we sit in and eat our lunch on a warm, sunny day. Now, in my opinion, I think the nature in Newark is actually more important in a lot of ways than the nature in Yellowstone National Park, and I'll explain why, for two reasons. First of all, the nature in places like Newark, is experienced every day by people. If people go to look at the nature in Yellowstone, they might do it once in their life, whereas if you live in a city, you're experiencing the nature all around you every single day. And secondly, more people experience the nature of Newark than do the nature of Yellowstone National Park or places like it. Some statistics: 3.5 million people visited Yellowstone National Park in 2010. 235 million people live in cities in the United States. That's 75% of our population.
With such concentrated population, public health becomes a major concern. As Dr. Clement Price explains, referring to Stuart Galashoff's book, Newark, the Nation's Unhealthiest City, Newark was long recognized as an unsafe urban environment.
Newark seemingly grew up overnight with no planning apparatus, very few navigational instincts or tools, and very few leaders who were willing to put in place a plan for its rapid growth. Another chapter, public health, drainage and water supply. My favorite chapter, cholera, garbage disposal. A chapter simply titled smallpox, and next to the last chapter, water supply. Galashoff presented a deeply stark image of Newark, one that the city struggled against for another century. In his conclusion, this is what Galashoff had to say. Throughout the period 1832 to 1895, communicable diseases were rampant: tuberculosis, pneumonia, and diseases of infancy and early childhood, accounting for the most deaths. As industrialization and rapid population growth compounded the dangers posed by urban living conditions, the municipal authorities slowly began to assume responsibility for protecting public health. The key word in that passage, key words, are slowly began. Galashoff's study of the foundational period of Newark's rise as one of the most industrialized places in North America was both a narrative on how notorious health conditions in Newark revealed how racial antipathy conspired against civic concern.
Third-generation Newark resident Kim Gaddy told the audience what happened when one of Newark's earliest industries, beer brewing, left the city. foreshadowing the nearly continuous tension between economic development and environmental health since then.
Pabst Brewery, that was founded in 1844. Kruger's, which was founded in 1852. Later it became Lyons and Sons Brewery. And in the 1930s and 40s, it became one of the biggest regional breweries in the Eastern region. 1961, the plant closed, and of course it moved out of Newark and it relocated to Rhode Island. And in 1988, instead of bringing some other kind of business or establishment, they opened up a shopping center. Ballantine Brewery, which was built in 1840, became the largest company in the United States at its peak, and for 115 years, they was located in the great city of Newark, and unfortunately, they closed in 1972. Anheuser-Busch, which later came in 1951, and in 1957, it became the largest brewery in the United States, and it is currently still located in Newark. And the main reason that these companies came here to produce beer was because of the quality of our drinking water, not bottled water, but our tap water, because it is pristine. And the basic ingredient that made these breweries very successful was the quality of the drinking water. And so Newark drinking water, because it was pure or pristine, as it fermented with the grains, it produced a special taste and a bitter taste, a great taste that folks from all over the world would love to purchase beer from this great city of Newark. And so that started that history of all these companies, and it was many more. My mother told me about 5 other ones that were located here. But unfortunately, when these companies left, and in particular, I can recall, I currently live in the West Ward. For the last 4 years, I'm originally a South Water all my life, and I used to ride up South Orange Avenue to go home, and that big old Pabst Brewery bottle, which was like larger than life. And every time I drove up there, I was like, what is this? What is happening here? And I watched overnight how they began to tear down this facility. The bottle was the last thing to come down. But I remember calling DEP myself, because when I drove down, I saw all these particles just flying in the air. And I said, old as this building is, there has to be asbestos in here. Had to be some contamination of the groundwater. It has to be some other environmental issues and air pollutants that are impacting the health. And sure enough, I got a call from Reverend Jeffro James and the church that was directly across the street, and they said, we need to fight Pabst Brewery, this company, and how they are just tearing down this facility without any regard to the public health of the residents.
Focusing on the ironbound community, Dr. Ana Baptista discussed how the history of business practice, combined with a lack of environmental regulation, resulted in an environmental and public health disaster.
A little bit about the history of the ironbound and the legacy of industrial development, that, like I said, predates even the Industrial Revolution, with mills and then smelting and tanneries and refineries up until today's incinerators and chemical plants. This was a community, like many communities, where workers and factories and people lived right up against cheek and jowl. You worked in the factory right next door to where you lived, and right up until very recent times, until the 1970s and 80s, and still today, you can see some of it in Newark, in the ironbound section. People live right up against factories and chemical plants. And there were no laws, up until the 90s. You heard from Professor Gold, the laws really came into effect, relatively recently. Back then there were no laws about, how you disposed of your waste or the emissions that were coming out of your stacks. And there was very little to control or regulate how workers and residents were impacted. We have stories into the 1980s, people like Manny Montero that Nancy Zach talks about, who watched in the middle of the night as barrels of chemicals were loaded into the property next door to his house or dumped on a site next to the elementary school. And without any recourse, there was nobody you could pick up the phone and call to complain about, because there really weren't too many enforcement actions back then. And one of the pivotal actions in the Ironbound defining moments really was the discovery, and I say the quote-unquote discovery, of dioxins from the Superfund site that's called the Diamond Alkali site. I call it discovery because people who lived in that community knew what was at that plant. They lived with it. They saw what happened there. And this was a plant that manufactured pesticides and herbicides, and things like Agent Orange, which is a defoliant that was used in the Vietnam War, and later found to contain this highly toxic chemical, one of the most toxic carcinogens known to man, dioxin. And it harmed many men who were sprayed with it in the Vietnam War and came home with cancer and horrible lesions, skin lesions, and tumors and defects. This was produced on the banks of the Passaic River in the Ironbound into the 1950s and routinely dumped into the river and stockpiled, uncovered, and blown throughout our community. Residents tell stories of playing on piles of Agent Orange, or watching workers break up Agent Orange into the river, into the Passaic River. And so that moment, in 1983, Governor Tom Kean at the time flew over the Ironbound to assess the damage and declared it in a disaster area, declared it in a disaster zone.
As Professor Steve Gold, an expert in environmental law, noted, this is not just history.
We're not only talking about legacies of the past when we talk about contamination and pollution in Newark. The federal EPA keeps a list of EPA-regulated facilities, all the facilities that emit air pollutants or discharge pollutants to our water, or release large quantities of toxic chemicals, or store, treat, dispose of hazardous waste, or are otherwise contaminated. We have 24 square miles in Newark. Would anybody care to guess how many EPA-regulated facilities there are in the city of Newark? 1,550. That's 65 EPA-regulated facilities per square mile, one facility for every 177 residents of the city, which probably means that's one for us here tonight. And that, of course, is just part of the overall polluting presence in Newark, because it only counts federally regulated facilities and not the many facilities that are regulated only by the state DEP. They have a list of active sites with confirmed contamination. There are 610 of those within the city of Newark.
From Irish immigrants to blacks and Latinos, there has long been a connection in Newark and other cities between race, poverty, and the location of environmental hazards. Community activist Henry Rose addressed what he terms spatial self-determination.
I'd like to be able to put Newark's industrial legacy in an environmental justice framework, focusing on spatial self-determination. And I chose that topic because I believe, as Sylvia Hood Robinson said regarding Africans in America, that from the Middle Passage to the new millennia, the environmental memories of the African in America are ones that elucidate a continuous struggle against a persistent pattern of severe environmental inequalities with morbid or mortal consequences in racialized space. She went on to say that they were continuously packed into dense and many times deadly geographic spaces which they had little or no control